on Islam, geopolitical, national security, and immigration issues. And I would love for you to look at his blog sometime, View from the Right. You can find it at http://anation, A-N-A-T-I-O-N. I'm sorry.
American, Amnation.
Amnation, thank you, .com. He will speak on macro issues, and then Andrew will speak on more theological issues. When Andrew comes up, he is a theological expert. He's getting his master's. He speaks several languages, including ancient Arabic, and he's going to show us in the text what's really there. Okay, thank you so much.
All right, should we stand here?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
See you. Thank you, Barbara. First of all, it's not correct to call me an expert on Islam. I am not. One does not need to be an expert on Islam to know enough about it, to know what a serious problem it is. I heard Wafa Sultan speak a few weeks ago in New York, and she said something about you need to know Arabic to understand the Islam problem. But I said to her, well, if that's the case, how is it that we have all these Islam critics in America who understand the problem? We don't know Arabic. So you don't need to be an expert. You do need to know the fundamental principles, the fundamental commandments and teachings, something about the history of Islam. For that, you don't need to be an expert. All of us have picked up enough of this knowledge just from reading the blogs. We all know what they are, and educating ourselves that way. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight, 3 points I'm going to be approaching. What is the reality of Islam? Why do we deny the reality of Islam? And if we stopped denying the reality of Islam, what would we do? Now, last week, a report was issued about the jihad massacre at Fort Hood in Texas. Probably most of you know, it's been written about pretty widely, that this 86-page report on why this openly jihadist, pro-terrorist, anti-American major in the U.S. Army not only was allowed to remain in the Army so that he could kill people, but that the report does not use the words Islam, Muslim, jihad, and as I just learned yesterday from Time magazine, I haven't read the report yet myself, it doesn't even mention his name, Nidal Hassan. So this is getting to a very, very extreme place. We are, as Barbara said, constructing, say, the ruling powers that be, the liberal powers that be in society with the Muslims, have constructed a false reality. And that false reality has gained power over us. There have been many such false realities in modern times. In fact, modernity, to a large extent, is almost a history of these false realities. Communism, Nazism, fascism, all kinds of extreme liberal beliefs, multiculturalism, and every one of these things has gained power over people's mind, has caused terrible damage, and ultimately people realize that it's false and start to reject it. So what we have to do, what everyone has to do, is assert the truth against this falsity. Now, the first problem that comes up is when conservatives see something like the cover-up of the jihad Islamic nature of the Fort Hood massacre. They say, well, political correctness is getting worse and worse, and it certainly is. The problem is, or part of the problem is, it's not only liberals that are engaged in that cover-up. Conservatives are engaged in it too. They also refrain from speaking frankly about the nature of the problem. They also don't want to use the word Islam. And what we have in America today is that in mainstream society, mainstream right, mainstream left, there are two views of Islam that are permitted. The left view is that Islam is a wonderful religion, and that if there's anything that seems bad about Islam or troublesome, such as terrorism, that's purely a response to something bad that we have done. So Islam is perfectly good. Anything bad about it is due to us. The conservative view of Islam is that Islam is a wonderful religion, except for one little part of Islam, which is a problem, which is extreme. And that's called Islamism or Islamofascism. And the conservatives use these terms and are very proud of the fact that they're not politically correct, because unlike the left, they don't cover up they don't refrain from using the real name for our enemy. They know that the name of our enemy is Islamism and Islamofascism. So, of course, the conservatives are much closer to the truth. They recognize that there is something about Islam which threatens us. But because they will not speak frankly about it themselves, they look. And when the leading conservative Islam writers and Islam critics are constantly telling conservative readers that Islam or Islamic extremism is a terrible problem, but then say that the solution to this terrible problem is that we have to reach out to moderate Muslims because they're the solution. That has such a confusing effect. That message it puts people one direction, then puts them in another. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be all scared and all riled up about the Islam problem, but then I'm being told that no, Muslims are really the answer. So there's really nothing left for us to do except to reach out to the moderate Muslims and hope that somehow they are going to change Islam. Well, I've talked about the false beliefs that characterize the modern world, these fantasy worlds that people live in. The belief in moderate Islam, the belief that moderate Islam is the solution to radical Islam, is just as much a false reality, a false, constructed, Gnostic distortion of reality that the other realities I've mentioned. Because the problem is Islam itself. And anybody who declines to say that is confusing and muddling the waters. Now, one of the ways that Western intellectuals of both the right and the left deal with the attempt to understand Islam is or rather how they avoid dealing with Islam, is that they have a variety of theories of what causes Islamic extremism. And I call these theories non-Islam theories of Islamic extremism. There's many of them. I have a collection of about 25 so far. You can go to my website. And they just cover the gamut. Basically, every issue which for the particular intellectual is his favorite issue will be the thing that he says is the cause of Islamic extremism. So if there's somebody a liberal, who feels that what's wrong with America is that we're so ungenerous and oppressive towards the third world, we don't give them enough aid and enough money, well, that person will think that Islamic extremism is caused by the fact that we don't give enough aid and money to Muslims. Somebody who is very involved in the issue of assimilation will say that, well, Islamic extremism comes about because we haven't tried hard enough to assimilate the Muslims. Another view, people that are focused on sex, say that the reason for Islamic extremism is that young Muslim men are sexually frustrated. And this is what drives them to jihad acts of murder. And, you know, now Nidal Hassan seemed to be a bachelor and was lonely. And, you know, there's some plausible basis for that. But then you have people on the right as well as the left, the Darwinians, who were very much into the biological level of reality. They want to explain everything in biological terms, so they'll say that the reason that jihad exists is sexual frustration. Another theory, Steve Saylor has pushed this, is that Islamic extremism exists because of cousin marriage within the Islamic world. Well, that's certainly a factor in the tribalism and other negative factors of those societies. But even if there was not cousin marriage, Islam would still be Islam. Some other non-Islamic theories of Islamic extremism. I'll just read them off quickly. Modernity produces alienation. Muslims become disoriented from living in Western society, which is so different from the society that they're familiar with. So they become the suicide bombers. Other immigrants do not become suicide bombers, but why do Muslims? Then there's the Bernard Lewis and Daniel Pipes theory, also, which is that Muslims are angry and aggressive because they feel inferior because they were left behind by the West. They were once a glorious civilization. They were once threatening the West. For the last 300 years, they've been very weak. They've been left behind, so they're angry. Pipes also wrote a column a couple of years ago in which he suggested that since being left behind is the reason that Muslims are angry, I forget if he said this or if he just implied it, but the clear implication was that, well, we need to help the Muslims feel good about themselves again. You know, let's empower Islam. Let's return Islam to the way it was in the 15th century, or the 12th, or the 9th. I mean, this is the kind of nutty, escapist theories that people come up with when they refuse to face the simple reality that Islam is Islam. Let's see if there were any others. Dinesh D'Souza said that Lawrence Auster is the cause of Islamic extremism, because by arguing that the problem is Islam, people like me who say that make Muslims angry, and therefore they start committing jihad. So,
Viva Lawrence Auster.
That's a heavy weight, Lawrence.
so the truth is that Islam is the source of Islamic extremism, and I'm not going to go into detail on that. I think Andrew will be discussing that in more depth. But I just want to approach one aspect of this that I think can capture the essence of what Islam is. I'm not a scholar of Islam, but I've read a fair amount of the Koran. You dive into it, you start to get a feel for it. And there is, and I've experienced this, the highest truth of Islam is the closeness to God, to Allah, not God, Allah, because Allah is not God. The closeness to Allah that the Muslim experiences when he is waging war for Allah, when he is killing and dying for Allah. This is the ultimate religious experience for the Muslim. And it's a very strange thing. Islam is a religion. Nobody can deny that it is a religion. But it is a most peculiar religion in that the heart and core of this religion is war waged against the dehumanized non-Muslim who must be subdued and crushed in order to bring about the goal, which is Islamic rule over the world. And this is why these texts have such a power. I have felt it myself at times reading these, not personally, but I could sympathetically identify with how a Muslim reacts to these words, these powerful texts. O Muslim, O follower of Allah, wage war against the Christian and the Jew until they have paid the jizya tax and feel themselves subdued. And in the last day, even the rocks and the stones will say, O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. These words have an emotional effect on the inner life of any Muslim who comes under its influence. And again, the majority of Muslims are not jihadists. And that most of them aren't even necessarily aware of that aspect of Islam. But it's there, and it's the core of Islam, just as communism is the core of communism. An analogy I made recently was that a way to understand the Islam problem is that you have, if Islam is a nation, and they think of themselves as a nation, well, the jihadists are the soldiers of this nation, and the regular members are the civilians. So it's a way of sort of picturing it. Yeah, the civilians are not on the battlefield; they're not waging war, but they are still part of the nation in whose name and on whose behalf the warriors are waging war. There is no mystery about the history of Islam. Throughout the history of for the last 1,400 years, for 1,000 years, Western Europe, Eastern Europe were under siege of the active jihad warriors. I'm not going to go into detail of those hundreds of years of wars and raids and capturing of people for slavery and the invasion of Gaul and the invasion of Austria and all the rest of it. But the West was extremely conscious for 1,000 years of the threat that it faced from Islam. How can it be that only 300 years after the last serious Islamic threat to Europe, which was in the late 17th century, just 1690, a little over 300 years ago, when the Muslims were driven back from Vienna, there's been a complete forgetfulness. It's as though that 1,000 years never happened. So again, this is why it's silly to act as though somebody needs to be a special scholar of Islam in order to understand the nature of the problem. All of us can understand the nature of the problem. Any common sense person with some basic knowledge of the world can understand the nature of Islam. Just as we understood the threat of Nazism. It's like I said, did people need to be scholars of Nazism in World War II to recognize what a danger it was? Did people need to be scholars of communism to know what a danger it was? Of course not. But we deny it. Why do we deny it? Why do we deny the obvious? And here we come. I've talked about false realities. In my view, the main belief, the main false belief that governs our society is, I call it liberalism. And the guiding principle of liberalism is that discrimination is the greatest sin. Must be avoided. Discrimination must be eliminated. The underlying idea is that basically all people are the same. All people are basically like us, despite superficial differences. And therefore, any discrimination is just wrong. This belief has dominated America and Europe since the end of World War II. It was, to a certain extent, it was a reaction against Nazism. We sort of, seeing the horrors of Nazism, the Western world went to this opposite extreme of liberalism and saying that any intolerance is the moral equivalent of Nazism. Any discrimination is the moral equivalent of Nazism. And I've told this story, and I'll tell it again. That belief has gone so far that a couple of years ago at a small meeting where I was talking about the need to restrict Muslim immigration, a man present who was the editor of a leading conservative magazine said, if we stopped Muslim immigration, we would be as immoral as the terrorists. That's the editor of a well-known conservative magazine. So it's not just nominal liberals that believe in this liberal ideology and are guided by it. It's many conservatives as well. The strangeness of our current situation is suggested by the fact, let me try this hypothetical. 70 years ago, if somebody had suggested, let's start admitting mass immigration of Muslims into the West, would there have been anybody who would have entertained it? Of course not. Everybody in the West would have understood that Muslims are very different from us. There's this historical war between Islam and the West. Their religion, their Sharia way of life is utterly antithetical to ours. Of course we're not going to let them in. Yet today, nobody even suggests reducing, let alone stopping, Muslim immigration into the West. Even the most outspoken Islam critics never talk about reducing or stopping Muslim immigration. That's how far we have reversed. That's how far inside the liberal mindset we have become. So just as we got into this craziness by embracing this liberal view of reality, we have to get out of it. The only way to get out of it is by speaking the truth, identifying the falseness of this liberal belief, and moving to a different situation where the truth about Islam can be spoken, where we can say, you know, these people really are sort of an enemy army. They really do not belong among us. And we have to start finding ways to reverse this Islamization of the West. And that is why also ACT, as Barbara was describing some of the activities of ACT for America, all these are necessary and good things, and I feel I want to get involved in some of them myself.
Hope so.
But any activism which tries to deal with the symptoms of the problem, but accepts the existence of the problem itself, is ultimately, in my view, a losing game. If we accept the presence of Islam in the West, we're just going to be foot dragging as they gain more and more power. The only solution, in my view, and I'm stating it very frankly, and I've been saying this for many years, Muslims in large numbers do not belong in any Western society. It was a mistake to let them in, and now we have to recognize that mistake and find ways to start reversing that immigration.
How?
All right? We start first. Now, let me just preface this by saying, I know that what I'm saying is completely impossible in the political society in which we now exist. I'm not a fantasist. I know that what I'm saying cannot be now, or next year, or in 5 years. In order for the things that I am proposing to have any possibility of coming into effect, we, America, to a large extent, would already have to have had moved away from that liberal belief that everybody's really the same and that discrimination is the most terrible sin. A change in mind, a change in thought will have to have occurred. So that's the reality that we have to move toward. Once that has happened, once Americans have become a people who are willing and ready to face the truth, then, and I'm not saying that we should hold off any efforts until some future, I'm saying we should push for it now. All Muslim immigration to America and to other Western countries as well must be stopped. And let me add also, ultimately this will not be effective unless all the countries of the West, and really non-Muslim countries as well, join together. But let's just speak about America in this context. Any exponents or believers in Sharia who are certainly those who are resident aliens and not citizens should be removed, as Geert Wilders himself has said. Any naturalized citizens. Also, anybody to become a citizen should have to take an oath that he renounces anything to do with Sharia. If he breaks it, he loses his citizenship. Muslim mosques and institutions that have anything to do with pushing Sharia and jihad must be closed. Now, when we say that Sharia is a disqualifier for American citizenship, now, Sharia really, it's not a small minority. Any serious Muslim, any believing Muslim, believes in Sharia. The Islamic law is essentially identical to Islam. Wherever Muslims are, they put the Islamic law into effect. When they are the minority, when they are an immigrant group, they start putting it into effect for their own community. They try to have Sharia courts for marriage and property and things like that. But then as they gain more power, they start to extend the reach of Sharia law more and more, and they get the surrounding society to conform to it. Moves like this, and also another thing is I think that we should propose that, tell the Muslim population, we will give you a certain amount of money, say $50,000, if you leave the United States and give up any claim to ever return. So it's a combination. It's a combination of forceful measures in some cases, carrot, stick in some measures, carrot in others, and the hope is that as the society becomes more restrictive of, and frankly hostile to Islam, that Muslims will start to leave on their own. Because Muslims generally come where they're welcome. What was the initial act that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar? It was when Muhammad and his 150 followers migrated, they were immigrants, into Medina. The Medinans welcomed them, and within a couple of years, that's when Muhammad began to gain political power, became the ruler, the dictator of Medina. That's the beginning of Islam. So immigration into a non-Muslim society is the archetypal act by which Islam spreads. But if a society does not welcome Muslims, they tend not to go there. So the hope is that the Muslims would begin to leave voluntarily. What if they didn't? What if then further measures might be necessary? Another problem is that the left we have the US Constitution, the First Amendment is a major problem. Congress shall make no law infringing the freedom of religion. Well, ultimately it may be necessary, and I have advocated this, to have a constitutional amendment which prohibits the practice of Islam in the United States. And that sounds very radical. But what is the Constitution for? It's to define the basic principles that define us as a society. The 13th Amendment banned slavery because society became to believe that slavery is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of country that we are. Well, the slavery of Islam is also fundamentally incompatible with the kind of society we are. So, and one more thing, then beyond the immediate question of how do we start moving Islam out of America and out of the West, it is hoped, my larger strategy, which I call separationism, is to quarantine Muslims within the historic Muslim lands. I don't see any other solution. There are people on the blogosphere who are more extreme than I, who want to kill all Muslims in the world and stuff like that. I think that all we have to do is reverse the situation, tell the Muslims in the West this really doesn't work. You know, you got to go, and basically confine Islam to the Islamic part of the world. If we did that, I think that the West would have been saved. So I will leave it there and open it up to. Should we have questions now, or is Andrew going to speak?
I think it might be nice for both of you to be up at the end and take questions. You know, answer them together separately.
Okay.
Whatever anyone wants.
All right.